Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. We're going to begin by hearing further from Mr. Anketell-Jones, who was giving evidence yesterday. So would you ask Mr. Anketell-Jones to come in, please? Good morning, Mr. Anketell-Jones.
Morning.
Ready to carry on?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Ms. Grange.
Thank you. Good morning. Thanks. So just a couple of questions now, back in the topic of insulation, before we pick up on the ACM story again. And I want to ask you about the use of Kingspan K15 on the tower. We saw in your witness statement yesterday that you'd referred to it being a phenolic insulation that was used on the tower. Were you aware that some Kingspan cool firm K15 had been used on the tower as well as Celotex RS5000?
No, I wasn't.
You weren't? You're never aware of that?
No.
And then, again, on the topic of insulation, I just want to look at the Harley specification for the Grenfell project. This is RYD 46822. So these are specification notes that were prepared, I think by Kevin Lamb, is that right, for the project?
Yeah, it's got his signature on it, or
Yeah.
title.
Yeah. Is this a document that you were familiar with while you were working on the Grenfell project?
No. I was focused on the other project that I was working on.
So you don't recall ever looking at this specification, noting what was in it, checking it?
No, I was only meant to be managing Kevin's time and to be a stop-in for the first part of the project until there was a project manager and designer on it.
Okay. Because the point was that there's no mention of the main insulation product here that was to be used behind the rain screen panels on the spandrels and the columns. So there's no mention in this document of the RS5000 insulation, and you can't help us as to why that might be.
No.
If we look within this document pack, there's some drawings below. If I could look at page 4. Do you see there that we are seeing drawings showing the insulation, and it's using a wriggly line, if I can put that in a very non-technical way, for the insulation? We see it on the left and we see it on the right. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Do you remember seeing that same marking for insulation on the Grenfell Tower drawings?
I can't remember. I probably would have seen them when I was doing the structural calculations. I can't remember.
Now, do you agree that that is the marking that's commonly used for mineral wool in the industry?
I wouldn't. I work on projects now where people use all different kind of hatches and symbols for different insulations, so I wouldn't be able to say that was commonly used for rock wool.
I see. So at the time, you wouldn't have noticed that that was a symbol that maybe suggested a different type of product?
No.
No. Okay, thank you. So, yes, then just before we leave this drawing, on the right, we looked yesterday at the Studio E Architect's red stamp, and we can see it there. And under A, we see conforms to design intent. And under B, we see conforms to design intent and then subject to incorporation of comments. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And I wanted to ask you about the meaning of design intent. Did you ever think on the project about what the meaning of design intent was? Was that ever something that you thought about?
No, I was focused on another project. I wasn't looking at this project in that amount of detail at all.
Did you know more generally that the architect was reviewing the drawings for design intent?
No.
No, that wasn't something you were aware of? No, okay. So picking back up on the topic of the ACM panels, We've previously discussed Class Naught, and you've given evidence already about what your understanding was about that classification. I just want to turn up where we see the definition of that. This is at CLG 50224 at page 122. So this is in approved document B. And if we look on the left column in the middle of the page, we see paragraph 13. Do you see that there? The highest national product performance classification for lining materials is Class Naught. This is achieved if a material or the surface of a composite product is either composed throughout of materials of limited combustibility or a Class 1 material which has a fire propagation index I of not more than 12, etc. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And I wanted to ask you about the reference there in the main part of that paragraph to lining materials. I appreciate you said that you weren't familiar with the detail of approved document B at the time of the Grenfell project, but was it your understanding that Class Naught was a classification that was primarily concerned with lining materials?
No. My only understanding of Class O was, at that point in my career, was that it was non-combustible, but it always needed to be referred back to the fire consultant.
So you didn't ever think about whether the fact that it was primarily a classification for lining materials might have impacted on its reliability as a classification for composite products?
No, I was completely unaware of that at that point in my career.
Did you ever think about how Class Naught applied to composite cladding products?
No.
Now, we know that Harley obtained the BBA certificate, the 2008 BBA certificate for the Rainabon panels. Harley obtained it from Deborah French at Arconic on the 23rd of April 2014, when it was sent to Mark Harris and Mike Alberston. I don't think we need to turn this up. The reference for that email is CEP 60281. I want to ask you, were you ever sent the BBA certificate for the Rainabon panels during the time that you worked on the Grenfell project?
Not that I have any memory of. I was completely focused on the other project and only looking at Grenfell when I was asked to look at specific small items or help out.
Can we just turn up that BBA certificate? It's at BBA 6047. So we can see there that it's British Board of Agrimont in the top right-hand corner, the certificate number 08. We can see, looking at the bottom of the page in the paler blue box, that the date of first issue was the 14th of January 2008, so significantly before the Grenfell project. Looking at this now, do you think that this was a document that you had seen at the time you were working on the Grenfell project?
I'd seen other BBA certificates to pass through to the design teams on other projects, but I don't believe I saw it in relation to Grenfell.
Were you familiar with BBA certificates more generally then, in terms of what their status was, what their significance was?
There were something that was asked for by the design team, and you'd usually request them and pass them on for review.
Would you ever read those certificates for the products that Harley was using on its cladding jobs?
If they were asking for something specific, I might have a look to see whether it had it in there to save wasting their time, but I would always send it on because I wasn't trained in those aspects.
And Harley never provided you with any guidance or training on how to read these certificates or interpret them?
No.
Do you think you had read this BBA certificate for the Rainabon panels at the time of the Grenfell project?
I can't remember reading it on that project.
So we can see on that first page, under key factors assessed in the second half of the page, that there's a statement about behaviour in relation to fire. It says there, in relation to the building regulations for reaction to fire, the panels may be regarded as having a Class 0 surface in England and Wales. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Do you remember noticing that about those panels in this BBA certificate?
No, I wasn't working closely on the project, and I wasn't responsible for the selection of materials, so I wouldn't have been looking at this. I was responsible for the structural design.
Now, I think you've said that at the time of the Grenfell refurbishment project, you did not appreciate that these panels were available with a polyethylene PE core, but also with an FR, fire retardant core. That's right, isn't it?
Yes.
Can you help us as to why Harley appear only ever to have advanced the PE variant and never suggested the FR variant?
No, I had no part in the selection of materials.
Did you ever seek any advice from Arconic about the suitability of using the Rainabond panels with a PE core at Grenfell?
No, played no part in the selection of materials on Grenfell.
Just want to look at page 5 under section 6. There's a section here on behaviour in relation to fire. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Again, looking at this now, do you think this might have been something that you had read prior to the Grenfell project?
No.
So you wouldn't ever look to read this kind of detail in the certificate?
On other projects, if someone was asking for something specific, I might look to see, like I said, to make sure that I wasn't wasting their time.
Yeah.
But I didn't understand the fire regulations, so I wouldn't assume to make any judgment on it. I would always pass it back.
Yeah.
The area of specialism that I had was structural engineering.
We can see at 6.1 and then at 6.2 that it's discussing both a standard sample of the product with a certain coating and then a fire retardant sample of the product with a different coating. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And again, I'm going to ask you again, does that remain your evidence that you weren't aware that there were these two different types of Rainabond panels?
No, I was not aware.
At paragraph 6.4, it says these performances may not be achieved by other colours of the product, and the designations of a particular colour should be confirmed by, and then in England and Wales it says test or assessment in accordance with approved document B. Now, was that something that you were aware of at the time of the Grenfell project? I appreciate you say you didn't read this detail, but were you aware that there might be differences in terms of fire performance as between different colours of the product?
No.
To your knowledge, were any investigations ever made as to the fire performance of the finish for the Grenfell panels that was used, the smoked silver?
No, I wasn't working closely enough on the project to know how the materials were selected at all.
And then at 6.5, it says, for resistance to fire, the performance of a wall incorporating the product can only be determined by tests from a suitably accredited laboratory and is not covered by this certificate. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Did you have any awareness that the performance of a wall incorporating products of this nature could only be determined by tests from a suitably accredited laboratory?
That's something I didn't learn until I went to Bath University.
Yeah. And then at 6.6, it says cavity barriers should be incorporated behind the cladding as required by the national building regulations, but should not block essential ventilation pathways. Particular attention should be paid to preventing the spread of fire from within a building breaching the cladding system through window and door openings. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Did you have any more general awareness at this time that when using these types of panels, particular attention ought to be paid to preventing the spread of fire from within a building through windows?
My only awareness of cavity barriers at that point was to always produce elevations that showed where they were, which you'd then send off to the fire consultant, who would add or remove them as they felt necessary.
Yeah. At this time, were you aware that there was a statement in approved document B which made clear that any test evidence used to substantiate the fire resistance rating of a construction should be carefully checked to ensure that it demonstrates the compliance that's adequate?
No,
You weren't aware of that?
no.
Was that Harley's practice more generally, though? Were you aware that Harley had a practice of ensuring that the fire resistance rating of a construction product was carefully checked by reference to test evidence?
On other projects that had similar questions raised, I would send off the information to a fire consultant and they would examine the evidence and confirm whether it did or didn't comply.
Yeah. On the Grenfell project, were you ever aware of that process having happened?
I wasn't working closely enough on the project to have seen whether that process happened or not.
Okay. Just another topic now. Did you ever have any informal meetings with Studio E and Building Control to discuss the design of the cladding on site?
No, I was, apart from trying to act as a stop-in at the beginning, I was fully focused on another project.
Mr. Crawford of Studio E, when he gave evidence to the inquiry, stated that there were a number of informal workshops with RBKC Building Control where drawings were discussed. Do you have any recollection of any such meetings taking place, as far as you were aware?
No,
Did you ever attend site and meet any representatives of Building Control?
there may have been somebody there at those first two meetings. I have no recollection.
Can we just look at Mr. John Hoban's statement briefly? So he was one of the building control officers who was responsible for the Grenfell Tower refurbishment project. And I want to pull up his witness statement. This is RBK 3033934 at page 7. So it's RBK 3033934 at page 7. Great, thank you. And so this is Mr. Hoban's statement. I want to look at what he says at paragraph 65. We can see at 64 above it, he's asked what advice or information was available and what assessments were made about the components that comprise the exterior of the building, their fire safety, fire resistance and compliance with safety standards. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And he says, I was provided with initial drawings and details and discussed the works with the architect and his specialist consultant dealing with fire matters. And then he says this, I also had a brief discussion with the engineer from the contractors installing the cladding system to the exterior of the building at the commencement of the works to the exterior. During that discussion, this is paragraph 66, I recall that I was advised by the engineer that tests had been carried out to the metal framework supporting the cladding. I also recall that I was advised that the system had been fitted to many buildings throughout England and Wales, to buildings of a similar height and construction. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And what we'd like to know is whether it might have been you who was the engineer from the contractors installing the cladding system that Mr. Hoban spoke to during this brief discussion.
I don't have any memory of this. I don't think it was myself. I don't know if he's referring to the engineers actually installing the cladding on the job.
Well, who would you think that was?
I don't know, the actual guys using the tools to install it on site.
And he's described as the engineer from the contractors installing the cladding system. Doesn't sound like the installers of the cladding. It sounds like somebody perhaps more qualified than that. Would you agree?
I don't know. A lot of people refer to engineers as installers as engineers.
I see.
Use it as quite a broad term.
Do you have any recollection of speaking to RBKC Building Control, or more specifically Mr. Hoban?
No. Until I was given evidence, I wouldn't have been able to say who the building control was or who the particular person was. I have no memory of ever speaking to them.
If you just go over the page at paragraph 67, over on page 8, he also says in the last sentence of that, I was also advised at the initial meeting on site by the specialist consultant that the cladding would comply with the standards set out in approved document B. So just for completeness, that's what Mr. Hoban says about those exchanges. Is your evidence the same in terms of whether you can recall any being involved in any discussions with him?
No, my involvement was so small on the project that I don't remember this at all.
Thank you. So I now want to turn to some exchanges that occurred in March 2015, which began with some queries about cavity barriers. Can we turn first up to HAR 406585 at page 3? Yes, so this is, if we look at the bottom half of the page, this is an email from Ricky Kay at Cider Eyes to Ben Bailey on the 26th of March 2015. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And the discussion is around the integrity of the cavity barriers. So he says, hi Ben, apologies for the delay. Please find below extract from the approved document of the building regulations, and he set out an extract from table A1 there relating to the performance of cavity barriers for integrity and insulation. And then below that, he has indicated that here you can see it's 30 minutes integrity and 15 minutes insulation that's required. Do you see that there?
Yes.
So there's a query about that. If we can just look at the rest of Mr. Kay's email, if we just scroll down. So he's justifying why their cavity barriers will meet those integrity and insulation requirements, and in fact will exceed the minimum requirements. And then if we scroll up to the bottom of page 2, top of page 3, Ben Bailey then responds. Perhaps if we can just see the date of the email on the page before, the bottom of page 2. So on the 26th of March, same day, Ben Bailey responds to Simon Lawrence, Simon O'Connor and others. You're not copied in at this point. And he says, Simon, and then if we can read up, he says, as discussed, please see the email below from the fire break supplier. There's quite a large cost difference between what Cider Eyes and the spec recommend and upgrading to the 120-minute barriers we discussed on Tuesday. Could you forward this to the client's representative for approval, please? Do you see that there?
Yes.
So Ben's making clear that there's obviously been a discussion about whether or not these barriers should be upgraded to 120-minute barriers. And there's some pushback here because of the large cost difference. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Do you remember this episode where there was pressure on site to avoid having to specify cavity barriers with 120-minute fire resistance?
I don't remember it, but I've been shown the information since.
So if we scroll up, then an email above that, we can see Simon Lawrence's response. So Simon Lawrence says to Neil Crawford, hi Neil, following Tuesday's design meeting, Harley via their supply chain are questioning the rating of the cladding fire breaks. Apparently by going to 2 hours, as we discussed, has a cost increase of around £12,000. Their supplier is saying it only needs to be 30 minutes everywhere as per the regs extract below. Could you take a look to see what you think and discuss with John Hoban, please? Do you see that there?
Yes.
And then if we go to the bottom of page 1 of this chain, we can see it on the 27th of March, so it's the email in the middle there, on the 27th of March, so that same day, to you, Ray Bailey copies you in on this chain and says, Dan, do you have any comments? Do you see that there?
Yes.
And we see your response at the top of the page. So there it is on the same day. And you say this, just that it's ridiculous. There is no point in fire stopping, as we all know. As we all know, the ACM will be gone rather quickly in a fire. The whole point is to stop unseen fire spreading in the cavity and moving to other parts of the building. Who is John and who is Paul? Are we working to the NBS spec by Studio E? Do you see that there?
Yes.
And I want to ask you about that response. What precisely did you mean by the comment, just that it's ridiculous?
From my training with structural design, I knew that aluminium facades were unable to resist a fire for very long at all and would just melt and fall off the building. So putting in a 2-hour fire break on that kind of facade was a waste of time.
Now, you say from my training with structural design, but what you've just expressed there is an opinion about the performance of the aluminium in a fire, isn't it?
Yeah, because in structural design, you have to consider how materials perform in fire.
Yes.
For the outside of the facades on any job, unless it's specifically required, they're not required to stay on the building in a fire. The failure mode for cladding in a fire is that it will melt and fall off.
So what exactly was it about the ACM which would mean it would be gone rather quickly in a fire?
That it was made from aluminium,
And what did that mean to you?
that it would melt at
Would
much
melt.
lower temperature than steel would.
Can you describe what the mechanism of failure would be for the aluminium composite material? What were you envisaging at the time?
That basically the aluminium rails and the brackets that supported them and the ACM would melt and fall off.
Did the core of the ACM panel feed into your thinking when you made this comment?
No,
Were you thinking about the combustibility of the panel?
no, not at all.
And how did you obtain this knowledge about how the ACM would perform in a fire?
We're speaking generally across the whole cladding, including the ACM, the cladding and the bracketry, from knowing how aluminium performs in a fire.
Isn't it possible, thinking back to that presentation by Sarah Colwell that we know you attended, that we discussed yesterday, isn't it possible that you were aware that there were issues with aluminium composite material involving PE cores and their propensity to promote the spread of fire across walls?
No, this is the fact that aluminium will melt quickly in a fire, and there's a fact that's known throughout the industry that in a fire an aluminium facade will not last very long. It will melt and fall off the building.
And in the next sentence, beginning, the whole point is to stop unseen fire. Can you explain how your view about the ACM was affecting your view about the cavity barriers? Can you explain that for us?
Because the view is that if it's going to melt and fall off the building, there's no point in putting a 2-hour fire stop on there.
So am I right that there you are expressing an opinion about unseen fire spread and what the requirement for cavity barriers was?
Yeah, from the opinion that I'd found on other projects, but it wasn't an educated opinion. The educated part of the opinion was that in a fire, structurally, aluminium will fail very quickly, and that reading down the email, you could see that the requirement was 30 minutes. Why would you put 2 hours on?
How is it consistent with your evidence that you were only ever concerned with structural matters, that here we see you expressing an opinion about cavity barriers and unseen fire spread across the building?
Because it's what I'd picked up from the email further down and from picking up bits and pieces over the years. But it wasn't an area I was trained in or had any knowledge in. On the other projects that I worked on, I would always send off the drawings to the consultants to be checked.
But you've used a phrase there, as we all know. This doesn't seem like you've just had a look at the email chain and then you're expressing an opinion.
No, as we all know, aluminium melts. Well in knowledge of that.
Was it your view that the cavity barriers would have nothing to expand against to resist the fire spread because the aluminium would melt?
Usually from the experience now looking back, the cavity barriers are only required to perform for a very short amount of time because of that. That's why 30 minutes fire barriers are selected.
Did you ever think about how a cavity barrier would work with an aluminium panel in front of them if you thought the panel was going to melt?
From all the videos that I'd sort of been shown by people at the MSC, it's been shown that most facades only last for about 15 minutes in a fire. So it's only to give you that length of protection.
Yeah, but you didn't know that at the time, did you? Because
No.
you hadn't done that course.
But I knew that aluminium melted at lower temperature. I know that it would last for a period of time, just not very long at all.
Given what you knew about how the ACM would behave in a fire, how did you think the external wall would adequately resist the spread of fire over the walls? Was that ever something you thought about at this point?
No, the combustibility of the panels was not something that I ever thought about. Only that they would melt and that there was no structural requirement for them to not melt.
Now that phrase, as we all know, were you saying it was common knowledge across the cladding industry that aluminium would behave this way, or more generally across the construction industry?
I think it's basic physics. It's known across the industry. I mean, it's what I was taught, on the MSc as well in the years subsequently, that alum melts.
When you were writing this email, did you ever pause and think, well, there are fire safety issues around ACM that we ought to make sure have been looked at?
This didn't raise any fire safety issues with ACM to me at all. It is just that it would melt. And
Sorry, carry on.
It was just that I was being sent little things like this and I was fully focused on another project.
We saw that third line, the whole point is to stop unseen fire spreading in the cavity and moving to other parts of the building. Did you consider the possibility that there could in fact be unseen fire spread behind the panels before they failed?
Not if there's cavity barriers.
So you didn't think that it might be an issue that there was unseen fire spread behind those panels before they failed?
No, because the cavity barriers were going to be installed, whether they were 2-hour cavity barriers or half-hour cavity barriers as required, they would be installed and stop that from occurring.
Now you say in the last line, are we working to the NBS by Studio E, the NBS spec by Studio E? Why did you query that? What was the relevance of that?
I was probably asking what was in the NBS spec. I mean, I was completely focused on another project and being sent small little tasks to do on Grenfell. I didn't have an overall idea of what was going on. It was, at that point, Kevin and Ben were running with the project.
So you didn't know that by now. This is March 2015. You weren't aware of whether they were working to the NBS spec and indeed what the NBS spec said. You weren't aware of that at this point?
No.
Why did you think that Ray Bailey was asking you for your views? If, as you say, Ray Bailey would have understood that you didn't have the qualifications to be commenting on fire and fire performance, why do you think he was asking you for your view on this cavity barrier point?
Just for another opinion from things picked up in the industry.
Let's consider the topic of cavity barriers then in more detail now. Based on the email exchanges we were just looking at, do you agree that you knew that cavity barriers would have little function in preventing fire spread if a fire got into the cavity between the insulation and the ACM cladding?
It's still the same case now that the cavity barriers in a rainscreen cladding are only required to give a small resistance, because after which point there will be no cavity. The aluminium will melt and fall off, at which point there won't be any unseen fire spread because there's no cavity.
But there might still be fire spread up other materials, including the insulation, and there might be fire spread through the core of these panels. Would you not accept that?
Looking back on it now, I would accept that, but at the time nobody was aware that any of these materials were combustible.
But given your awareness of the limitations of cavity barriers, as we see in this email, did you ever consider how important it was to prevent the fire spread into the cavity in the first place?
Not on this project, because I wasn't working closely enough to it.
So why not? You're the design manager. Why did you never think about stopping fire spread into that cavity in the first place?
Because I was the design manager responsible for making sure that Kevin was working to program. Once there was a project manager involved, I was barely involved with the project at all, and through all of that I was fully focused on another project.
At the time of the Grenfell project, were you aware in general terms of regulation, building regulation functional requirement B34, that the building should be designed and constructed so that the unseen spread of fire and smoke within concealed spaces in its structure and fabric is inhibited? Were you aware of that?
I wasn't aware of it in those terms. I knew that cavity barriers were required to stop fire spreading in the cavity, but I wasn't in the knowledge of what that requirement was.
Can we just look at approved document B, just to test in general terms what your knowledge was? Can we go back to that? That's CLG 50224 at page 82. So if we look there at paragraph 9.1 at the top of that page, it says this: concealed spaces or cavities in the construction of a building provide a ready route for smoke and flame spread. This is particularly so in the case of voids in, above and below the construction of a building, e.g. walls, floors, ceilings and roofs. As any spread is concealed, it presents a greater danger than would a more obvious weakness in the fabric of the building. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, did you have a general awareness of the dangers posed by concealed spaces and unseen fire spread at the time of the Grenfell project?
Yes, I had a general awareness of it, and that's why I always sent it off to the experts.
We see at the bottom of that page, diagram 33, provisions for cavity barriers. Do you see that there?
Yes.
If we look at that. Now, I know you've said you didn't read ADB at the time of the Grenfell project, but I think you said yesterday that sometimes you were sent little extracts from it on projects, or professionals would refer to bits of it.
Yep.
Had you ever seen diagram 33? Did you see it during the time of the Grenfell project or any time before you worked on the Grenfell project?
I think on some other projects I may have been sent it.
So you think you were probably familiar with this diagram at the time you worked on the Grenfell project?
Not familiar. I was aware of it.
And did you ever think to have a look at it? So we saw just now you were providing Ray Bailey with your thoughts about cavity barriers and performance. Did you ever think to have a look at the cavity barrier provisions in approved document B when you gave that advice?
No, because it wasn't my area of expertise.
Do you agree with me, looking at this now, that it's clear that cavity barriers ought to be provided to close around openings? We can see the grey shading, which is the symbol, which is the code for cavity barriers in the key below. and we've got that label at the bottom left, close around openings, and you can see cavity barriers at the head and the sill of that opening. Do you see that there?
Yes, I see that there. But subsequently, after Grenfell, working on other projects, I would disagree that this was clear. And I think that this diagram made it confusing because it was showing it for a house rather than a tower block. And I think it was further confusing by the fact that they showed the cavity barriers in such a light colour. Experienced many problems since then where these were scanned and sent to people and they didn't come out, and subsequently approved document B has been revised to make that clearer.
I see. But just to be absolutely clear, your evidence was you didn't consider this
No.
diagram at the time of Grenfell, so this is your subsequent reasoning. And even if the grey comes out, we've still got the close around openings and the arrows, haven't we?
Yes.
So would you agree with me looking at this now that it is clear that there should be cavity barriers around the windows, certainly at the head and the sill of a window?
Looking at this now, yes.
And if we can go on and look at 9.3 of ADB, which is, I think, the next page, 83, we see there it says in the text as well, cavity barriers should be provided to close the edges of cavities, including around openings. Do you see that?
Yes.
It couldn't be clearer, could it?
No.
Now, do you agree that Harley specified the cavity barriers that were to be used on the Grenfell Tower project? Ciderized cavity barriers.
From the evidence I've been shown subsequently, I can agree that. At the time, I wouldn't have known who specified them.
So that's in the Harley specification that we looked at earlier, RYD 3046822. Let's bring that up, actually. RYD 3046822. So this is the familiar to us now, I would say, set of Harley specification notes. And you see in the bottom left-hand corner, we've got fire breaks for the new build zones and fire breaks for the refurb zones. And we can see that they're ciderized Lamatherm cavity barriers. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Did you, or to your knowledge, anyone else at Harley, ever make any investigations with ciderized as to whether those cavity barriers had ever been tested in a rain screen system?
Not that I'm aware of on that project. I wasn't working closely enough to it.
In your view, would it have been possible to comply with the guidance in diagram 33 at Grenfell Tower and to have put cavity barriers around the windows?
You mean my view now, looking back?
Yes.
Yes, it would.
Yeah. Now, if we can return briefly to the request for information that was sent on the 17th of September 2014 that you submitted. This is EXO 401291. So we looked at this yesterday from you to Simon Lawrence, 17th of September 2014. And I want to look at, so this is you asking about the required extent of the horizontal fire breaks within the cladding areas. And in the suggested solution, you say, we believe that they will be required at every floor level on the vertical columns, but not in the area of cladding between windows. This is because there's no chimney effect here, and therefore the cladding will not add to the spread of fire. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, prior to making that request and giving that suggested solution, did anybody look at any guidance, either in approved document B or any other relevant industry guidance? And we know now there was other guidance as to what the extent of cavity barriers ought to be.
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Can we now look at a Harley drawing? This is HAR 408902. Now, in this drawing, what we can see is that cavity barriers have been added to the design and are represented by the honeycomb mesh on the right. Do you see that there?
Yes.
In the top right. Do you agree that cavity barriers in the location you've specified did allow a chimney effect at the nose of the column?
I'm not familiar enough with the design of the job to be able to say that or not.
Can we then return briefly to the email chain that began with your request for information on the 17th of September 2014? If we go to HAR 403638, I want to read the email at the top of the chain. So again, we looked at this yesterday. Can you confirm your position in relation to Terry's comment below about combustibility and continuous cavity paths? Do you see that there?
Yes.
And he talks about John Hoban having been assiduous about checks at the Kensington Aldridge Academy. Did it concern you at the time that there did appear to be widespread confusion as to the use of cavity barriers in the facade amongst the professionals on the project?
I think at the time my knowledge wasn't what it is now from having been educated on it. It concerns me greatly now, looking back at it. But at the time I don't think I was educated enough to be able to form an opinion as to what they were saying.
Right.
I was able to make judgments about how aluminium performs structurally and why putting 2 hours on didn't seem very logical to me. But I wasn't educated enough to question those people in those positions of authority.
If we can look at, within this chain, there's an email from Neil Crawford to Terry Ashton on the 18th of September, up on page 3 of this chain, at 12:18 in the middle of the page. So Neil Crawford says to Terry Ashton, "Hi Terry, please see attached our sections and the initial drawing set we have had from Harley's. The initial drawings from Harley's are fairly limited, but they attempt to establish the basic approach." Do you see that there?
Yes.
Do you agree that the Harley drawings at this stage were limited in terms of what they showed?
I can't remember what the Harley drawings would have shown at that stage.
Considering that work on site had started on the 2nd of June 2014, was it normal for detailed design questions such as these to be raised at this late stage?
On other projects that I would have been the designer on, I would have expected things like that to have been closed out sooner.
Can you explain why we don't see a comprehensive strategy relating to cavity barriers at any point on the Grenfell project?
No, I can't.
Whose responsibility was that? Or would you have thought was that at the time?
I would have thought that both the architect, building control and Ryden shouldn't have been able to sign off any of the design if they hadn't seen that first. And they should have requested it.
Can we now look at an email, HAR 403691? This is an email from Simon Lawrence to Neil Crawford and Kevin Lamb, and you are copied in there. We can see that at the top. And it's dated the 16th of October 2014. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And Simon Lawrence says, "Gents, I think we will definitely have an issue with the kitchen window. We roughly marked it out in flat 145 and it oversails kitchen lounge screen by about 200 millimetres. It looks bad. Regards, Simon." Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, was this a reference to gaps being created by the positioning of the new windows significantly out from the position of the old windows?
No, I have no idea. I was working on another project. I was being given bits and pieces to do here and there, but I wasn't keeping up with any of this because it wasn't relating to management of time or program.
Did you ever consider whether the gaps created in that location were problematic from a fire safety perspective?
I have no idea if this relates to gaps at all.
So you can't help us on that.
No.
Now, just in terms of the cavity barrier design, and I just want to look at this point at the NBS specification. This is SEA 50169 at page 69. And look at clause 342. So if we blow that up, so this is a heading, it's within the H92 rain screen cladding section of the NBS specification, and it's headed Contractor's Design of Rain Screen Generally, and we see there that and we looked at this yesterday, that the design standard was to the CWCT standard for systemised building envelopes. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And I think you said that you weren't aware that the system had to meet that CWCT standard. That's right, isn't it?
No.
No, you weren't aware.
No, I wasn't.
Yeah. Now, that standard included providing effective fire breaks. Now, the NBS spec further required the system to contain fire stopping to the requirements of the building regulations. We see that just down in the same section. Can you see it says functional requirements?
Yes.
It says, as specified in this section, with fire stopping to the requirements of the building regulations. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Did you ever think about what that phrase meant in terms of Harley's work?
I never read this document in its entirety.
Well, the rain screen, the H92 rain screen cladding section is about 11 pages long. So even though the document is very large in its entirety, this H92 section is not huge. You can't remember reading the H92 section of it?
No. I wasn't the designer on the project.
And if we look on at page 71 at paragraph 490, we can see there's a requirement for cavity barriers to BS 47620. Do you see that there?
Yes.
So would you agree that this NBS specification is requiring fire stopping to the requirements of the building regulations, including cavity barriers?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, we know that Studio E had produced drawings at tender stage, which did include some references to cavity barriers. If we can look at this drawing, and we'll need the offline version, this is SEA 402499. And I want to focus to begin with in the top right-hand corner, the proposed section, typical bay. So this is one of the Studio E tender drawings. And we can see there, and it's the fourth label down on the right-hand side, P10435, and there's a little hatched rectangle at the head of the window. It says this: ensure horizontal and vertical cavity barriers meet tightly. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, do you remember being aware of that at the time you were working on the Grenfell project, that the Studio E drawings did show some cavity barriers?
No, I don't recollect that at all. I wasn't the designer on the project.
So you didn't think to familiarise yourself with the tender drawings as part of your job as design manager and in any supervision of Kevin Lamb's work?
No, my supervision of Kevin Lamb's work was entirely limited to programme and passing information on to Ray. I was working on another project full time. If I'd have had the time to be able to look at this properly and work on it, then we wouldn't have employed Kevin.
I see. Now, if staying with this drawing, if we go on the left, if we just zoom out in a minute, and I'll just find the right section, I want to look at the proposed plan at sill level. Yes, so it's in the middle of the page on the left. Yeah, if we just go down to get that. Yes, so there you can see a column detail on the left, and we see a label coming out, cavity fire barrier in line with compartment wall on the column. Do you see that there?
Yes.
if you didn't look at these drawings at the time, does that mean that there's no point asking you about the other little bit of hatched, or the other hatched item that's actually at the very corner of the column where it meets the spandrel? Can you see there's another bit of hatched drawing there?
Yes.
It doesn't have a label.
No.
And I wanted to ask you whether that might have indicated that a cavity barrier should be there, but you can't help us, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I was just asked to be a face to Rydens until we could get a designer involved. And once the designer was involved, I just had to make sure he was keeping up with his programme requirements.
Now, we can see that you're copied into an email of the 14th of January 2015 in which Kevin Lamb sent to Simon Lawrence the full set of drawings relating to the upper 20 floors of the windows. If we go to RYD 2027692, and we can see from that email that Kevin Lamb is sending it to Simon Lawrence and copying you and others in. And he attaches a large number of drawings, and he says, Simon, please find attached a full set of drawings related to the upper 20 floors of windows, all now construction issue and to be manufactured accordingly. Clearly the design has varied much, but now all as we agreed prior to Christmas. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, did you check through those drawings to ensure that you were broadly happy with them?
No, I wasn't in a position or technically qualified to be able to check through those drawings and make sure I was broadly happy with them. I would have literally just been checking that he was producing the drawings and making sure that the client was being kept happy from that point of view.
So that's why you're copied in, are you? Simply to check that he was producing something?
Yeah, I wasn't. He was more experienced than me. He was brought in because he was more experienced. I didn't have the time and was fully committed to another project. Now,
none of these drawings showed any cavity barriers around the windows. I just want to look at some of these drawings. If we can look at RYD 2027697. This is a jam detail showing the interface between the aluminium window frame and the column, including the cladding, the aluminium cladding coming out with the strong black line at the bottom, and then the insulation along the column. You see that there?
Yes.
And would you agree that there's no provision on this drawing for vertical cavity barriers at the window jambs?
I agree that there's no cavity barrier shown on this drawing.
And we know, we've traced through the history of this drawing, we know it was never revised subsequently. We can see that from the Harley drawing register. We don't need to turn it up, but for the transcript, that's RYD 3065622. Did you ever discuss the topic of cavity barriers around the windows with Kevin Lamb?
No, I was purely looking at structural requirements on this project. I was working on another project full time, and the only instructions I'd been given by anybody was to keep an eye on his progress until a project manager could be appointed.
Kevin Lamb says in his witness statement that he, particularly at the beginning, would have a number of discussions with you and Ray Bailey to think about the concept design. Does that mean you never discussed in any of those discussions anything to do with cavity barriers around windows?
No, because I wasn't educated in that. On any other projects I was working on, I would have always sent it off to the design team asking for their advice.
Can you help us as to why these drawings have been approved for construction without cavity barriers shown around the windows, given approved document B, diagram 33 that we looked at, and other industry guidance that we looked at 2 days ago, which all make clear that cavity barriers should be provided around windows?
No, I can't, because I wasn't involved with the design process there.
Can we look at an email of the 3rd of March 2015? This is SEA 3012850. This is an email from Mr. Lamb to Simon Lawrence and others, just to Simon Lawrence, but copying you and others in. And he says, Simon, please find attached drawings now showing the fire breaks, both horizontal and vertical. We assume a requirement of 90 minutes integrity and 30 minutes insulation is sufficient. If not, please advise. The vertical breaks are not on all columns, just party walls. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Can you help us as to who or what prompted Mr. Lamb to include cavity barriers at this stage?
No, I can't.
In your experience, would you expect cavity barriers to be such a late addition to the design process? This is March 2015.
My experience now would be that they're always shown at the very beginning.
If we can turn to a drawing produced by Mr. Lamb, which was attached to this email, this is HAR 408581. And this is Harley drawing C1059200. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And there's a stamp approved for construction. And we can see in the little notes at the bottom of the page in the table that fire breaks have been added on the 3rd of March 15. Can you see that there?
Yes.
And if panning out again, just looking at this elevation, we can see that there are hatched lines which now show vertical and horizontal fire breaks. Do you see that there? They're marked, they're labelled as well.
Yes.
Can you see those? So there are randoms. Is it your understanding that the word fire break here is referring to cavity barriers?
I have no idea what he'd be referring to on these.
So that you never queried that with Kevin Lamb? You
No.
never checked what he meant by fire break?
No, because I was just meant to be looking after his program requirements, and probably at this stage he had a project manager to be reporting to instead.
The cavity barriers marked on this drawing are not located around the sides of the window, are they?
Not shown on this drawing, no.
More specifically, the drawing does not show any cavity barriers around the head, sill or jambs of the windows themselves, does it?
Not shown on this drawing, no.
Can you also see that the horizontal cavity barrier above the window is not at the level at the head of the window, but it's been moved up higher than that and a little way up the spandrel panel? Do you see that there?
Yes.
Do you know why that was?
No, I don't.
Did you ever query that?
I would never have looked at these drawings in relation to fire. I would have been purely looking at these drawings in relation to structural requirements.
Now, if we can go to another drawing, this is HAR 408470. So this is the window head detail where the aluminium window frame is coming up and meeting the panel, the return of the panel at the top of the window. Do you see that there? And
Yes.
can you see that? And there's no provision for cavity barriers at the head of the window in this more detailed drawing, is there? It's a 1-in-2 drawing.
No.
If we look at revision E of that drawing, produced on the 3rd of March 2015, this is at RYD 50220, and I think we'll need the offline version. RYD 50220. Yes, that's it. So this is revision E, and we can see in the little table at the bottom, in the middle, bottom of the page, that on the 3rd of March 15, a fire break's been added. Do you see that there?
Yes.
So this is a more detailed image, which helps us, it's a section, which helps us see that how Kevin Lamb had done it in that bigger elevation. And you can see the fire break now with the hatching, with the kind of honeycomb hatching fire break. And you can see how far up away from the head of the window it is. Do you see that?
Yes.
And do you agree with me, we've looked at it just now, that this was in contrast to the Studio E employer's requirements drawings that did show a cavity barrier directly at the head of the window?
Looking at the two pieces of information presented to me now, I can agree with you on that.
Do you agree with me that that's a worsening in the cavity barrier strategy? Because what you've got here then at the head of the window is a potential route for fire to pass into the cavity between the rain screen panel and the insulation.
You asking me with my knowledge now? Or?
Yes, actually, I am.
Yeah.
Now you've looked at these drawings.
Yes.
But just to be clear, that wasn't something you noticed at the time or were aware of at the time?
No.
Or even checked for at the time?
No, I wasn't trained in that. I wouldn't know what the requirements were. If I had looked at these drawings, it probably would have been at an early stage to have designed the structural components for their structural performance.
But didn't you think it was important that somebody at least had a kind of general check of Kevin Lamb's designs for cavity barriers to check that they were broadly in compliance with relevant requirements?
So at Harley, I don't know who that would have been. And with all the other projects that I worked on, you always referred it back to the fire consultant to have that check done.
But why wouldn't that have been you on this job as the design manager?
Because I was only responsible for ensuring that he was keeping to programme until a project manager could be appointed.
Had you worked on other projects by this time which did have cavity barriers around windows?
Not that I can remember.
You'd never had experience of cavity barriers being designed around windows prior to Grenfell?
No. A lot of the projects I'd worked on before, I'd worked on a couple of cladding projects, but done a lot of curtain wall projects, which were all internal, so it was fire stops rather than cavity barriers.
I see. So your experience was curtain walling and fire stopping, not rain screen, cladding and cavity barriers. Is that what you're saying?
I'd worked on projects with cavity barriers, but I'd always deferred to what I was told to by the fire consultants and building control.
Now, can we just look at your witness statement? This is HAR 3010149 at page 9. I want to look at paragraphs 36 and 37. So you say this: with the benefit of hindsight and having regard to material I have seen since the tragedy, such as the drawing details produced by Harley and circulated by the media, I can see that window openings into the cavity should have been closed with cavity barriers, as required by approved document B, diagram 33. And then you say this: as far as I am aware, this was not part of Harley's package, as a separate cavity closer was never shown on the architect's details. Therefore, I would assume that the job of internally closing the window cavity, as per approved document B, paragraph 9.13d, should have been carried out by another one of the subcontractors working for Ryden in relation to the internal fit-out package. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
Now, given what we've seen this morning, what was said in the NBS specification, given that Harley had tendered and successfully been awarded the design of the complete entire external wall package, can you explain why you're saying it wasn't Harley's responsibility to provide cavity barriers around the windows?
I think when I wrote this, I hadn't been given the full information and I didn't remember what was on the project. And I thought that people were talking about the way that you would close the dry lining to the back of the window. I thought people were talking about the cavity in there for the paragraph 37.
So are you saying that you were mistaken in paragraph 37, given what you now know?
I was mistaken into what cavity people were referring to.
it's clear, isn't it, from the contemporaneous documents, the emails, that RFI that you send on the 14th of September 2014, that you thought that Harley had responsibility for putting in the cavity barriers, horizontal and vertical, on that facade.
Yeah, even looking back on it now, I would have thought it was Harley's responsibility.
Yeah. And you say at paragraph 38, in the last sentence, you say, I believe the architects should have included cavity barriers around the window openings in their design, and the fire consultants and building controls should have picked this up when reviewing the drawings. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
I appreciate what you've said about the architects, but can you help us as to why nobody at Harley picked up that there ought to be cavity barriers around the windows?
Talking from hindsight and looking back, there were lots and lots of projects that didn't have cavity barriers around the windows. I don't think that it was known within the industry or appreciated because of the conversion from cavity masonry walls to rain screen cladding. I think that a lot of people thought that it was something you did for cavity walls rather than rain screen cladding. So I don't think that anyone at Harley knew that. And it doesn't appear that anybody further up the design team knew that as well.
I see. Okay. Cavity barriers in the crown. Did you ever think about, on the project, what was necessary in terms of cavity barriers at the head of the building or around the crown area?
No, I wasn't involved enough with the project, but I can say that it's still something that is difficult for a lot of consultants to work out what to do at the head of buildings.
Okay. Did it ever occur to you, or did you ever have any discussions with anyone on the Grenfell project about the potential risk of vertical or horizontal fire spread in relation to the crown if flames were at the top of the building? Is that ever a topic that was discussed?
No, I don't think anyone was aware that any of the products were in the slightest bit combustible, so I don't think it would have been something anyone considered throughout the whole design process.
Did you ever have any conversations with Mr. Lamb about the positioning of cavity barriers at the head or around the crown of the building?
No.
Can we turn to a document INQ 30140064? INQ 30, that's it. So this is a copy of your LinkedIn profile that was taken yesterday on the 15th of September 2020. I assume this is something you're familiar with.
Yes.
And we can see there your name at the top and your skills and the summary of your abilities and qualities there. And then what you've done is you've set out your experience below in reverse chronological order. And I just want to look at page 2, at what you say about your time with Harley. So there you explain you were with Harley for 9 years and 7 months, and you split out the time that you were a technical and engineering manager between September 15 and March 2016, and the time that you were a design manager between September 06 and September 15, 9 years, 1 month. Do you see that?
Yep.
And that's entirely consistent with what you said to us when we went through your background. Just want to look at what you say about your work as a design manager. You say managing design, build and supply contracts to major contractors in the building industry. The position involves taking the project from receipt of order through to completion, for which the job can be categorised as follows. And there we've got detailing, design and survey, planning and coordinating, material procurement and production details, budgetary control and client liaison. Do you see that there?
Yes.
So would you agree with me that there, what you're summarising what you did at Harley was taking a project from start to finish and dealing with all the design elements relating to the cladding project. Would you accept that?
On a project where I was the designer, yes.
And we see there in item 1 detailing design and survey. It's not qualified in relation to structural design, is it? Or
No, on those jobs I would have been doing, I would have been doing the detailing design for putting the system components together to be signed off by the design teams.
And we've also got in item 3 material procurement and production details. So you do indicate that during your time at Harley between September 06 and September 15, one of your areas of responsibility as a design manager was for material procurement. Do you see that there?
Yeah, on the projects where I was a designer, that's what I would be doing.
And would you agree that there's no qualification there about only focusing on structural design?
No.
Mr. Chairman, I've come to the end of my questions.
Yes.
But at this point, it's customary to break and see if there are any others that I ought to pick up.
Yes. Well, shall we take the usual break at this time, and then you can
That would be,
collect your thoughts and decide whether
That would
there are
work
more
perfectly.
questions that need to be asked. Yeah.
thank you.
Well, Mr. Anketell-Jones, Ms. Grange has got to the end of the questions that she thinks she needs to ask, but we have to give her a chance just to review things and decide whether there's anything she needs to come back on. So we shall break now until 25 to 12, please.
Okay.
And then at that stage, we'll see if there are any further questions. So perhaps you'd go with the usher, but please remember not to talk to anyone else about your evidence when you're out of the room.
Yes, sir.
All right? Thank you very much. All right, 25 to 12, please. Yeah. Yes, would you ask the witness to come back in, please? Yeah. All right, Mr. Anketell-Jones. Well, we'll see if there are any more questions for you. Miss Grange.
Yes, just a few short questions. Whose job was it within Harley at the time of the Grenfell project to think about fire?
There was nobody assigned across the whole company to do that role.
So just nobody was assigned to do it.
No, each individual person would look after the responsibility on their project.
Right. And so does that mean it fell to Kevin Lamb to be thinking about fire on the Grenfell project?
It would fall on Kevin and Ben.
Kevin and Ben, okay. Different topic. We looked at the phrase design intent this morning with reference to the Studio East stamp and what they were doing on the drawings. Just in more general terms, if you see on your projects the reference to design intent or checked for design intent by an architect, what do you understand that to mean?
You mean now?
Yes, now.
Now I'd always challenge that to get them to actually set out what that was in a matrix.
Assuming you couldn't challenge it, what do you think design intent means when referred to by an architect?
So if I just had to look at it and assume what they were meaning,
Yeah.
I would assume that it met their intent drawings.
Aesthetically or in terms of statutory compliance or both?
Both.
And what about back at the time of the Grenfell project, if you'd been asked the question, what do you think an architect means when they use the phrase design intent? What would your answer have been?
I think it would have been the same then. It just wasn't on any of the other projects that I'd worked on. It had never been something that I'd noticed before.
I see. Now, we've been through a lot of material over the project in the last 3 days. Would you do anything differently if you had the chance to do it again?
I think looking back on it, because my role was very limited in the whole thing, and I was only asked to dip in and out, look at one piece of information there, and to do the structural design. I think at that point I didn't have the education or the knowledge to have picked up on any signs that things were missing. So I don't think I could have done anything differently without the education that I have now.
I see. Okay. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, those are all my questions.
Yes. Good. Thank you very much. Well, Mr. Anketell-Jones, those are the questions we have for you. Thank you very much for coming to give your evidence. I'm sorry it's taken a little longer than we originally thought it might, but at least you're finished now and you're free to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
No, Ms. Grange, I think we probably have to rise for a minute or two, don't we, for housekeeping purposes?
Yeah, I think some cleaning and other procedures have to happen before we hear from Mr. Kevin Lamb.
10 minutes, long enough?
I think 10 minutes is fine.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Well, we'll rise now. We'll come back at 10 to 12 then.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Miss Grange, your next witness, I think, is Mr. Lamb. Is that right?
That's correct, Mr. Kevin Lamb. Thank
Right.
you.
Could you ask Mr. Kevin Lamb to come in, please?
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Mr. Lamb.
Good morning.
Sit down, make yourself comfortable.
Thanks.
All right? Yes, Miss Grange.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you, Mr. Lamb, for coming and attending to give evidence today. We really appreciate it. If you have any difficulty understanding anything I'm saying to you and asking you in the course of your evidence, please ask me to repeat the question or put the point in a different way.
Okay.
If you feel you need a break at any point, please let us know. And also, please try to keep your voice up, because the lady sitting to your right is taking down transcription
Okay.
of what you're saying. So if you can keep your answers nice and clear, that's really helpful. Now, you've made a statement to the inquiry. It's in a folder on your desk in front of you, and it will appear on the screen. If we go to HAR 30-10419, we can see it there. And if we turn to the final page, there we can see it's dated the 4th of December 2018. And is that your signature?
It is, yes.
Have you read that statement recently?
Yes, I have. Yeah.
And can you confirm that the contents are true?
Yes, yeah.
Have you discussed your statement or your evidence with anybody before coming here today?
No.
Now, I just want to start by considering some questions about your background and qualifications.
Okay.
And if we can start by looking at paragraph 4 of your statement on page 1, you tell us that after leaving school, you began a career in mechanical engineering, and you indicate there some qualifications that you obtained in mechanical engineering. We see that there.
That's
yes?
correct. Yeah.
And then at paragraph 5, you say you entered the glazing and cladding industry in 1988.
Yeah.
And you started as a window installer in a small company. And then you say, because of my engineering background, I was also involved in manufacturing work in the factory, glazing on site, and minor design and estimating in relation to shop fronts. We can see that there.
That's right.
Yes. And then if we go to paragraph 6 over the page, you tell us that in 1991, you were employed by FAS Limited, FAS Limited, a large domestic PVC and aluminium window company, as a design and estimating manager.
That's correct.
Do you see that there? And is it right for that company, you tell us at the end of that paragraph, that you designed windows and curtain walling? Is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
So does that mean you weren't designing cladding systems? You were predominantly focused on curtain
No.
walling and windows?
Exactly, yes.
Yeah. And you refer to some Daytech AutoCAD training courses.
Mm-hmm.
So are those courses to help you do computerised design work?
Exactly, yes, that's right.
And then at paragraph 7, you say that shortly after that, in 1992, you joined another company called Metfab Systems,
Yeah.
a commercial aluminium company specialises in glazing, air traffic control towers and rain screen cladding. Do you see that there?
That's right, yeah.
Now that sounds like quite an eclectic mix. Certainly the air traffic control towers.
I think there's a limited supply for air traffic control towers, so you need something to fill up the gaps in between orders.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. And you're saying there that you specialised in the design of, you're a design manager, specialises in rain screen cladding.
Yeah.
Is that right? So is
Yeah.
that where cladding starts to come in as well
That's
as
right, yeah.
curtain walling?
Yeah.
And then between 1996 and 2000, you tell us in the next paragraph, paragraph 8, that you were employed as a technical architectural advisor for cladding systems at a leading cladding company called Schuko.
That's
Do
correct.
you see that there? Can you help us as to what your role as a technical architectural advisor involved?
This was helping write NBS type specifications. The primary role was regards to glazing, although they did have a small amount of rain screen cladding systems on offer. It wasn't a primary role.
Right. And just to be clear, you're not a qualified architect, are you?
Not at
No.
all, no.
When you were working at Schuko, or prior to that, during any of your employment or studies before that, did you learn anything about the nature of thermoplastic materials and their behaviour in relation to fire?
Not specifically, no.
Would you say that you developed a specialism working in cladding in these companies?
No, my specialism was glazing, really.
Yeah.
Glazing and curtain walling.
Yeah. And does that mean, we'll get to the Grenfell project in a moment, that prior to doing the Grenfell project, you would have said your specialism was in glazing and curtain walling, but not in cladding?
On the whole, I was a freelance draftsman, so I could draw many different types of product, but my experience was mainly in glazing.
Yeah. During your career, did you ever undertake any specific design qualifications which related to facade engineering or something
No,
similar?
no.
Have you ever, or at the time of the Grenfell project, had you ever received any specific training or education on fire safety within facade design?
No.
Now, looking then at paragraph 9 of your statement, which is up on the page here, you explain that you began working as a freelance designer, trading under the name Bespoke Designs in
Yes.
2000.
Yes.
Can you help us as to what kind of design services you were offering as Bespoke Design?
It's drafting work under the direction of various clients. It was to cover a shortfall in clients' own resource pool. So if they felt they had a project, they didn't have the workforce to complete it, I might be called in.
So does that mean that the service that you were offering was not as a main designer of a facade, but as a make-weight, as someone who was making up a design team?
Yes, simply, yeah.
Is that fair? If
Yes.
you don't agree, please.
Yeah, I mean, it's not to belittle it, but it was to cover shortfall in resources.
Now, in paragraph 10 of your statement, you explain that in total you've had 30 years of experience in design and manufacture within the cladding industry.
Yeah.
And you say in that paragraph that your career included projects of varying sizes, including some with ACM rain screen cladding,
Yes.
aluminium composite material rain screen cladding. And you've referred there to a car park project in Hemel Hempstead. Do you see that there?
Yes. Yeah.
Can you recall any other projects in which you worked on a design involving ACM?
The only one really of any note would be another project for Harley. However, it wasn't a full design package. It was just to produce some schematics.
Was that the Talcott's project?
It was, yes.
Yeah. So you just did some schematics?
Yes, I think their internal design team were freed at that point to be able to design that one fully.
And how long were you involved in that Talcott's project doing that work?
Probably 2 weeks.
Yeah. Prior to the Grenfell project, had you ever worked on a high-rise residential building over 18 metres?
Yes.
Had you ever worked on a high-rise residential overcladding project involving ACM?
No.
You explain in paragraph 9 of your statement that you came to know Daniel Anketell-Jones during the time that you worked under your trading name Bespoke Design.
Yeah.
You say you started to employ him as a designer and you employed him for around 3 years. Is that correct?
That sounds right, yes. Yeah.
In what role were you employing him as a designer for you?
I think he started off as a technician and very quickly was promoted to project designer.
Was that as a project designer in structural matters?
No. He'd only just come out of university, so he wasn't qualified in structural matters. No.
Right,
We were purely a design resource, drafting resource.
I see. So implementing other people's designs
That's
in
correct.
practice
Exactly, yeah.
and drafting those. Was it your relationship with Daniel, as far as you know, that led to you being contacted for the Grenfell Tower project?
It would have had a factor, I'm sure, although I had worked for Harley previously.
Yeah. And that was on the Chalcots project?
That's correct.
Any other projects you'd worked for Harley?
No, that was the only one I'd done beforehand.
Yes, I think you say that, in fairness, that's at paragraph 12 of your witness statement, that you'd worked for Harley on one other project. If we go down to paragraph 12, maybe on the next page. Yeah, prior to this, I'd provided the design service for the company on one other project, albeit limited to producing design details for a project proposal.
Yeah.
So is that the schematics at Chalcots?
That's right, yes.
Yeah. And you say also in paragraph 12, sorry, no, that was, you've clarified what that was. So just to be clear, you weren't actually doing the project design work yourself on the Chalcots project?
Not the full design, no. No, we only did the preliminary schematic drawings that I believe Ray took to a meeting to propose
Yeah.
what they were intending.
And can you help us as to what kind of features you would expect to see on those preliminary schematic drawings?
There were aesthetics.
Yeah.
So it was a couple of pictures of windows and cladding interface through to the windows.
Yeah. Was your first experience of substantive facade design work for Harley on the Grenfell Tower refurbishment project?
As far as overcladding was concerned, yes. Yeah.
Were you, at the time you worked on Grenfell, a member of any specialist cladding industry bodies or associations?
No.
So not the CWCT?
No, that's more applicable to organisations than individuals.
Yeah. Have you since become a member of any specialist?
No.
No. Industry bodies. Prior to the Grenfell project, had you undertaken any formal training on the building regulations and the associated guidance in the approved documents, including approved document B?
No.
During the project, did Harley provide you with any training, formal or informal, on the building regulations and associated guidance?
No.
Did you get any formal or informal training through Harley to keep up to date with industry codes of practice for the design and installation of cladding and windows?
No.
Now, in terms of your awareness of previous cladding fires at the time you worked on it, on the Grenfell project, were you aware of any previous fires involving external cladding facades on high-rise residential buildings?
None at all.
None at all?
No.
So you hadn't heard, for example, of the Lacanau House fire in Southwark in
No.
2009, or any fires before that in Liverpool or Scotland?
No.
Or any fires abroad in, say, Dubai, a spate of high-rise buildings in the UAE in 2012 and 2013,
No.
including some in Dubai?
No.
No, you weren't aware of any of those. While you were working on the Grenfell project, did you become aware of any
No.
cladding fires? So does it follow that you weren't aware that there had been external cladding fires involving cladding with a PE polyethylene core
No.
at the time you worked on the project?
No.
Can we look at paragraph 11 of your witness statement back on page 2? So this is with the heading email material. And you say here, you say at Harley Curtain Wall Limited and later Harley Facades Limited, I used a Harley email address while working on the Grenfell Tower refurbishment project. Prior to my appointment as the project designer and in the immediate days afterwards, as well as on a few other occasions, I also used my bespoke design email address to correspond with those at Harley and others such as Ryden and Studio E. And then you say, within your statement, you've exhibited some of that correspondence.
Yeah.
Is it right that your laptop, which you worked on during the project, became corrupted subsequently?
That's correct, yes.
Can you tell us what happened to it and when?
Yes, I can't remember the actual date, but it was Christmas time when Windows 10 was on offer as a free upgrade. As with many other people, after entering into the simple upgrade, it corrupted my machine.
Right, yeah. Did that laptop store the emails that you sent and received on the project, which are referred to in paragraph 11 of your statement?
It did, yes. However, a lot of my emails were specific emails would be printed out and kept on file.
I see.
Which are the exhibits that
Yeah.
I put in my...
Have any emails, do you think, been lost as a result of your laptop becoming corrupted?
I would be amazed if there's anything of any relevance.
I see, okay. So you've been able to retrieve, have you, emails relating to your bespoke design email address as well as those relating to your Harley email address?
There was a period that I've lost, but at this stage in the Grenfell project, I'd probably only used it a few times because very quickly Harley provided me with their own email.
I see. So it might have been emails that you exchanged with individuals at the beginning of your involvement
Very
on the
much so,
Grenfell
yes.
project.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
So in August 2014.
Yeah.
What would you think the period would be of emails that you might have lost?
It would be easy to see as soon as I was given the Harley Curtain Wall email address.
Yeah.
I would have stopped using my own.
Right. Yeah.
So we could easily refer
might be
back
able
to
to work
the
it out.
earliest of my emails.
Have you tried to take steps to recover the emails that were lost?
No, because I didn't feel there was any need.
So now I want to turn to how you became involved in the Grenfell project and look at that in more detail. And at paragraph 12 of your witness statement on page 3, you describe that you were approached by Daniel Anketell-Jones, who was working as a design manager at Harley Curtain Wall, about providing a design service for Harley. Do you see that there?
That's right, yeah.
Do you know, or did you know at the time why you were being approached? Was that explained to you?
It wasn't explained, but as with all of my approaches, they're generally because there's a shortage in their own resource pool.
Did you become aware subsequently that that was why you'd been approached? Was that explained to you?
It wasn't explained to me, but it was immaterial.
Okay. And then in the next paragraph at 13, you say, I attended a meeting with Ray Bailey, the director of Harley, and Daniel Anketell-Jones on the 12th of August 2014. And then you say, in advance of that meeting, and you list out there a number of things that you were sent, including the contract program, a 3D computer model, some CAD models, and you explain some of what that contained. Do you see that there?
Yes, yes.
And you've exhibited some of the drawings that you were sent to your witness statement.
Okay.
Can we just have a little look? So at exhibit KL2 that you refer to in that paragraph, we see that there were sketches from another Harley project called Ferrier Point. If we go to HAR 30100416, so I think we can see from the label at the bottom right-hand side on this drawing that it's referring to Ferrier Point. Do you see that there?
Yes, yeah.
And these are Harley drawings. Did you consider these drawings when you were sent them?
It was explained to me that this was going to be the concept design to be applied to Grenfell. This was in Harley's terms a proven solution.
I see. So they did explain to you that that's why you were being sent the details of this project?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. Were you aware that the type of cladding used at Ferrier Point was Rainabond ACM, the same?
No,
was used at-
I was aware it was ACM, but never considered the manufacturer.
Were you aware that it was Rainabond ACM and that was going to be the same as at Grenfell? So you say you weren't, sorry, you start again. You weren't aware of the manufacturer, but were you aware that the same cladding manufacturer was going to be used?
I was told in the first meeting with Ray and Dan the materials that we'd be using.
Okay.
So it wasn't specific to these drawings. That had been very clearly laid down, what I was expected to be using.
And what materials were you told you would be using at that first meeting?
It would be rigid insulation,
Yeah.
which would be a Celotex type product, and it would be ACM. And the ACM would be hook-on cassette panels.
You say, did they actually use the word Celotex type product?
I don't recall, to be honest.
You don't recall?
No.
Now, we can see further from the sketches, I think you've just referred to it in your last answer about that you were told they were hook-on cassette panels at Grenfell. We can see from these sketches at Ferrier that this was actually a face-fixed system, wasn't it, riveted to the building?
That's right, yes.
Did you notice that at the time that this was a face-fixed system?
Yes. This was given as a guide, and I was told, although that this is face-fixed, you would be providing the design for a cassette option.
And did you know what that meant?
Yes, totally, yeah.
Had you designed facades with the cassette type fixings before?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. But not for a high-rise residential building?
Not with ACM.
No.
I've done it for solid aluminium.
Yeah. We can also see that the insulation used at Ferrier Point, according to this drawing, was 200 millimetre rock wool duo slab insulation. If you look at the label, I think you might have to blow this up at the very...
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. So just to help the panel as well, at the very bottom left-hand side of this drawing, if we can blow it up, there is a small label that says there, rock wool Duraglass rigid insulation. Do you see that there?
Slab, isn't it?
Sorry,
Duo
absolutely.
slab,
Duo slab rigid insulation. Were you aware of that when you were sent this, that this was a mineral wool insulation that had been used at Ferrier Point?
I was aware that a mineral wool wouldn't be used on Grenfell because there wasn't enough zone to provide thermal values.
Who told you that?
It was at the very first meeting with Dan and Ray. I don't recall at that particular point who was talking.
So not enough zone, does that mean...
On this particular job, there's a 315 millimetre zone, which means you can easily get 200 millimetres of insulation.
yeah.
I don't recall the exact zone on Grenfell, but it wasn't deep enough
Yeah.
to get the correct amount of insulation.
So that's the distance between the concrete, the original concrete, and the rain screen panel.
That's correct.
Wasn't deep enough, you were told, to put mineral wool insulation in there.
No, I was told to put Celotex type rigid slab.
Yeah. And was that something you ever had a discussion with them about, or was the position that you were simply told that?
No, I was told the materials that they'd selected.
Yeah. Had you used mineral wool on yourself on previous projects involving rain screen cladding systems?
Yes, yeah.
Had you used any Celotex products previously when designing rain screen cladding systems or working on the drafting of the drawings?
I've used Celotex type products in the past, but not on rain screen, no.
So did you note that this was going to be the first time you'd used that product?
When you say note, I mean, I was aware,
Yeah.
yes. But because I wasn't doing cladding on a day-to-day basis,
Yeah.
it was no surprise because it was a few years since I'd done cladding. And I think that the Celotex is a relatively new product anyway.
Yeah. When you say it was a few years since I'd done cladding, what's your estimate as to how long it had been prior to the Grenfell project that you'd worked on a cladding project?
I would think it was probably Chalcott's, 6 years prior to this. Yeah.
Now, at paragraph 14 of your statement, if we go back to your statement, HAR, there we go, thank you. You describe the meeting that you had on the 12th of August with Ray Bailey and Daniel Anketell-Jones. And you say this at the beginning, you say, at the meeting we discussed the project and the scope of works. I was told that the design was going to be a hook-on cassette configuration rather than face-fixed, and the aluminium composite material cladding was going to be used. I also remember discussing the specially extruded aluminium profiles which were going to be used. You say that there. So you don't mention the insulation there, but is it your evidence that you were told at this meeting that it would be a rigid insulation?
Yes,
that
yes,
would be used?
definitely, yeah.
But I think you said you couldn't remember whether you were told it was Celotex at this point.
No, I don't recall whether it was Celotex, but it was always going to be a rigid insulation, a PRI type material. But the thermal calculations had to be provided to come up with the thickness.
Yeah. And you've referred there to a PIR type material. Can you help us as to what you mean by that?
It's a rigid insulation slab rather than a mineral.
Did you know PIR to mean polyisocyanurate?
Never gave it a second thought, to be honest.
Yeah. Can you help us as to what was discussed, whether anything else was discussed at that initial meeting? Was anything else discussed?
As far as the specification of the project?
Just in terms of your role on the project and what you were being asked to do.
I was being asked to provide the drawings under the technical team from Harley. Obviously, I was given a programme, an indicated programme, for which I had to confirm I could work to.
And who did you understand to be the technical team at Harley?
Well, it varied over the period, but at that stage, it was primarily Dan and Ray. I think there was recourse to Mark Stapley if necessary, but they were the two front runners as far as I was concerned at that point.
Was this meeting, on your understanding of it, an interview for Harley to decide whether you would be engaged to work on the project, or was it effectively your appointment was a done deal and this was your introduction to the project?
That's correct. It was a done deal. I mean, when I spoke to Dan previously on the phone, it was a case of, do I have the capacity to do this particular job? It's going to require a certain amount of hours. And I said, yes, I'm sure I could deal with that.
Yeah. Do you recall whether any questions were asked in relation to your experience or your abilities in relation to high-rise facade design?
Definitely not.
Were any questions asked about your experience in terms of cladding design as distinct from windows or curtain walling?
No.
Were any questions asked about your qualifications or experience?
No.
And can you just help us as to what you came away with from that meeting in terms of what the extent of your role would be?
My role would be to act as a drafting service to transfer the architect's drawings into fabrication drawings, which are dimensionally accurate and could be transferred as product drawings so as the whole thing could be manufactured and installed.
Did you understand you were going to be the project designer?
I think you don't want to read too much into that term.
Why?
I think there's a general consensus that once you put the word designer in there, there is an element of responsibility, far more than maybe there should be.
Were you being referred to at the time as the project designer or the lead designer?
I was never told I was the lead designer. I was told I was a project designer. The first I knew of that was when they had some business cards printed up with my name on. but that didn't stop me from being quite clear that I was working through their technical team.
What was said to you about the extent of supervision you would be getting on the project?
I don't think anything was specifically said. I was told that everything would go through Dan, but as a remote source, I wouldn't see really what that process would be. I can only assume when I sent drawings to Dan, he would discuss them with Ray, and then the comments that I got back would be acted upon.
Did you understand that you had to send your drawings to somebody at Harley for some kind of checking process to occur?
Yes, all of my drawings would go through the Harley team, yeah.
And what did you understand they were doing to them when you sent them?
They would review key drawings for concept.
For concept, what does that mean?
Compliance with their instructions to me. I was very much designing for Harley as a direct client rather than designing for anyone else.
And was it your understanding that they would be checking those drawings for compliance with relevant regulatory requirements, such as compliance with the building regulations or other associated guidance?
Yeah, I would expect an overview from them. But ultimately, in my history, the responsibility for compliance would always fall down to the architect, which is the main reason for him checking off all of the drawings.
We're going to come back to this topic in a minute because it's a key topic.
Yeah.
But I just want to ask you one further question on that at this stage. Where did that understanding come from on the Grenfell project? Were you ever told, by the way, the person checking compliance on this project is the architect, we at Harley won't be checking for regulatory compliance?
No, I was never told that. No.
So that was an assumption you made on the project, was it?
Yeah, based on 30 years of never doing it a different way.
I see. Were you asked whether you would be comfortable working on a large-scale high-rise facade project without direct supervision?
It was never implied I wouldn't have any direct supervision.
Right. So you assumed you would be supervised
Yeah, definitely, yes.
during the
Yeah.
project?
Yes, you wouldn't expect a client to employ a third-party design source and then just let them get on with it. That'd be very dangerous to a commercial.
So that was not your understanding of what was going to happen?
No, not at all. No.
And did you understand in practice that you were being supervised during the project?
Yes, yeah.
By who?
Some of it was by Ray, some of it was by Dan.
I see. Were you given any information about Harley's contractual responsibilities or their scope of work and how you were being expected to help fulfil that?
I wasn't told about contractual responsibilities, but the scope of work was very clearly laid out from Ray in the first place, Ray and Dan in that very first meeting.
And tell me about that scope of work. Where did Harley's work begin and end?
Well, it was quite clear. They issued me with a copy of their quotation. And on that quotation, there's a small 3D model, and it really identifies the whole scope of what they priced for. So every element on that quotation had to be drawn.
And did you understand that it was a quote for the entire facade works?
That's right.
To Grenfell?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, I just want to turn to paragraph 79 of your witness statement. This is HAR 30/10419 at page 18. And I want to look at the bottom of page 18 and onto the top of 19. So you say this there. Although I was not aware of the exact wording of the contract agreed between Ryden and Harley, I would assume it was to provide a complete facade envelope consisting of replacement windows, improved insulation and decorative overcladding as specified and designed by the architects. I assume it also included managing the operation and work teams to ensure works were completed in a timely fashion. Do you see that there? And then if we go over the page, with minimal disruption to the residents, always with a view to conforming to health and safety standards and good working practices. Do you see that there?
Yes, I agree with that. Yeah.
Was that your assumption about the contractual position, you've said, I would assume it was to provide a complete facade envelope.
Yes,
Yeah.
it was my assumption. I was never led to believe anything else.
And did you understand that that would include cavity barriers in the facade?
Yes, yeah.
Were you ever given an opportunity to read any of the contractual documents? We know now that there was a letter of intent and appendices appointing Harley as the facade subcontractor. Did you ever see any of that
Now, that sort of information would not be divulged to myself.
No, yeah. What was your understanding of Studio E's role insofar as it applied to Harley's work?
It was their responsibility to check all the drawings produced to suit their design intent and for full compliance.
Now, you've just used that word design intent. Can you explain what you understood at the time checking for design intent would involve?
Well, what they intend the design to look like and how it was to perform, which obviously would include full conformance.
What do you mean by full conformance?
With building regulations
Yeah.
and the other standards that are applicable.
So just to be absolutely clear, your understanding was that the architect would be checking for design intent and full compliance with all regulatory requirements, including the building regulations.
Definitely.
And again, was that an assumption that you made based on past practice?
Yes, yeah.
Did you ever have any conversations with anybody within Harley or at Studio E about what Studio E were doing in terms of their role on the Grenfell project?
No, I think it would have become obvious if we'd had drawings returned to us without comments. I'm sure the architects, if they felt it wasn't their role, they would have made quite clear rather than just kept commenting.
I see. So at no stage did you get the impression that they weren't checking for statutory compliance?
Not at all, not at all.
Did you ever become positively aware that they were checking for that? Did anything ever stand out? And
When they were, they were certainly involved in discussions about cavity barriers. If they weren't checking for compliance, I'm sure they would take a step back.
now, you said in that paragraph that Harley was to provide the complete facade envelope as specified and designed by the architects.
That's right.
Can you help us as to what you mean by that, as specified and designed?
But the architects have provided the design, which is apparent on their drawings issued, and they're specified. The specification is the NBS specification that was supplied.
But in practice, we know this was a design and build contract. Did you know that at the time, it was design and build?
It never crossed my mind, to be honest.
Well, forget the design and build, but in practice, wouldn't it depend at what stage the design was handed over by the architect to the cladding subcontractor?
Potentially, yes, yeah.
Might you have a situation where all the architect's done is look at very general concept design and aesthetics, and it's gone over to a cladding subcontractor at quite an early stage in the design process, leaving the subcontractor to do the detailed design work?
Well, firstly, the architect's drawings were very detailed and the specification was very detailed. And my client, Harley, instructed me to carry on with the drawings based on their documentation.
Yeah. Did you note that at the time, that you felt that the architect's drawings were very detailed and the specification was very detailed?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Can I just check?
Yes.
What I understand you to be saying, Mr. Lamb, is that on this job at least, your function was not to develop the design, simply to translate the architect's concepts as shown on their drawings.
That's right.
Into drawings that could be used for fabrication and construction.
Exactly, yes, yes.
Okay.
Just breaking that down a bit, would you accept that not all the products to be used in the external wall had been specified by the architects?
There may have been a couple. I don't know what specifically. But I mean, my guidance was from Harley.
Yeah. Well, we'll come to look at some examples of that in due course.
Okay.
But also, would you accept that there was still some design work to be done on the facade, for example, in relation to cavity barriers?
I understood the drawings as offered were fully a full representation of what they required.
I see. So you took those as the complete article, did you?
That's right. I think they were issued as construction issue drawings, and when they're issued as that status, then we would expect no further redraws by the architect.
When you say they were issued as construction issue drawings,
Yeah.
what do you mean by that?
Well, the architect, in the early stages of a project, they may have tender issue drawings.
Yes.
Now, they would be issued to subcontractors or builders to offer prices.
Yes.
But before the full design starts, the architect would raise those to construction issue to say, look, this is exactly what we want. And then you would base your drawings on their final drawings.
I see. So are you drawing a distinction between the drawings, for example, that Studio E did as part of the employer's requirements with the MBS specification, which formed part of the tender?
If they were marked up as tender, on the bottom of the drawing, generally they will be marked as tender or construction issue.
And here, when you're referring to architects' construction issue drawings, are you talking about drawings issued after, for example, Mr. Crawford has commented on your drawings?
No, most of his drawings should have been complete before I was even brought on board.
Complete for construction issue?
That's correct, yes.
Doesn't construction issue mean that they can be sent and actioned on site and products ordered, etc.?
No, there's two directions here. Harley's drawings have to go. Harley's drawings are based upon the architect's construction drawings.
Right.
So they're issued to the architect as approval. He will make his comments upon those until they get to a construction status. Now, one would assume that he's done the same process with his client, being the KTCMO or the builder or whatever.
Again, is that an assumption that you made, or do you actually know that's what happened on the Grenfell project?
I don't know what happened on the Grenfell project. All I do know is that you would generally treat any drawings from an architect which are marked for tender, you would treat those suspiciously, because they may not portray the exact requirements from the architect.
I see. Okay. Well, we're going to come back and look at some specific drawings later, which I think might help flesh out what your understanding was of different drawings by Studio E and Harley at different stages.
Yeah.
Were you informed at this first meeting with Daniel Anketell-Jones and Ray Bailey, or indeed at any other stage in your work on the Grenfell project, that Harley's work needed to comply with a curtains structural performance specification?
No, I don't recall that, no.
Can we just pull up that document? That's ART 50914. So this is a structural performance specification. It's done by Curtains Consulting for Studio E on the 1st of March 2013. Did you ever see that document on the project?
I may well have done, but I don't recall referring to it.
If we look within the document, if we go to page 11, paragraph 7.1.13, this is where the overcladding is addressed, and it says in that paragraph 7.1.13, the system should comply fully with the recommendations of the BRE document, Fire Performance of External Thermal Insulation for Walls of Multi-Storey Buildings, 2nd edition, 2003. Do you see that there?
Yes, I do.
Were you familiar with that guidance?
No.
So you didn't know that that guidance is otherwise known as BR 135?
I didn't, but I was aware of BR 135.
I see. So you were aware of BR 135 at the
Yes.
time of the Grenfell project?
Yes.
Okay. We'll come back to that shortly. Now, paragraph 95 of your witness statement, if we go back to that on page 22, you state in the middle of line 1, you say, as I've explained above, the architects reviewed Harley's drawings, and as part of that process, I would expect any non-compliance with the building regulations, and in particular parts related to fire safety, to be picked up and flagged. Do you see that there?
Yes. Yeah.
And you assumed that Studio E had the benefit of specialist advice from, amongst others, fire specialists. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And that expectation, again, can you explain where that came from? Was that something that you were told on the Grenfell project, or just an assumption you made?
It was an assumption based on normal working practice.
Did you ever make any inquiries to ascertain whether Studio E had in fact engaged fire specialists?
No, I didn't, but it became apparent during the course of the project that they had.
Yeah. Did you understand that Harley and those working for Harley, including yourself, had to independently check whether the drawings you were provided with were compliant with the building regulations, including parts relevant to fire safety?
No.
Was it your understanding that other parties were relying on Harley as the specialist subcontractor, being aware of those requirements, those statutory requirements?
Not having seen the contract, no.
When you say having seen the contract, what do you mean by that?
Well, you mentioned the contract earlier
Yeah,
that Harley's received from Rydens,
yeah.
which implies that they should have been doing that.
Implies that Harley should have been doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I was not aware of that because I didn't see that documentation.
At the time, does that mean that you didn't think it was any part of your role to be checking whether or not the designs were compliant with the statutory requirements, including the building regulations?
I would certainly consider anything that seemed out of the ordinary, just as a matter of diligence.
Yeah. So it was only if something stuck out and looked odd
Yes,
that you would check it.
that's correct. Yeah.
Otherwise, would you make an assumption that it was compliant with relevant requirements?
That's right. Or I may discuss it with the technical team at Harley.
Now let's look at your scope of works. Let's look at your quote that you put in. This is HAR 10415. So this is a document which you prepared, is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
Bespoke design at the top. It goes to Harley and for the attention of Dan Anketell-Jones. We can see that on the left-hand side.
Yeah,
And it's dated the 12th of August 2014. So this is the same day that you met Ray Bailey and Dan Anketell-Jones, is that correct?
correct, yeah.
Did you prepare this document before the meeting and take it with you, or did you send this afterwards?
This was sent afterwards.
And you say there in the covering, this covering part of it, Dan, further to your email, 7th of August 14, and our meeting this morning, sorry, it was clear that you've done this afterwards. Please find below our quotation for design services to the aforementioned project. Do you see that there?
Yeah, that's right.
So you were quoting for design services on the project.
Drafting, yeah.
Drafting.
Yes, yeah.
When we read design services there, could we substitute that for drafting services?
Yes, yeah, yeah.
Now, you refer to an email of the 7th of August in that covering part.
Yeah.
Don't think we've ever seen that email. Can you recall what that said in general terms?
That email had the documents listed where it says based upon.
Yeah,
These documents were in that email.
I see. So, yeah, we've got a list at the bottom of what you were sent.
Mm.
Turning to page 2 of your quotation, we see the design services. So we've got elements at the top, and it's got GA design. Is that general arrangement design?
That's correct.
And then you've broken it down, and we see in the third point, you've got cladding there.
Yeah.
Do you see that there?
Yeah.
Does this mean that you were quoting for designing the overall composition of the cladding system
No.
and not only the detailed fabrication drawings?
No.
So in relation to the cladding, what were you quoting for? What was general arrangement design in relation to cladding? What did that involve?
These are the translation drawings taken from the architect translating his design into Harley drawings.
And just to be clear, were you ever told that the architect's drawings only took the design so far and that there was more design work that needed to be done as part of your job?
No, not at all. No.
Now, you say at bullet 2, then we've got schedules and fabrication drawings, and then we've got other items there, and that included the windows from the 4th to the 23rd floors.
That's right.
Yeah, and the cladding.
Mm-hmm.
And then we can see if we go to page 3, under the heading notional task times, we could blow that up. So you've got initial drawing issue 2 to 17 days, depending on element selected. Design freeze TBC, what does that mean?
It's sometimes there is a critical path point in a program where all of the designs have got to be approved by the architects.
Right.
I didn't put it in there, and maybe it wasn't told to me when that was. So.
And then total design period approximately 41 days, we can see that there.
Yeah.
How did that estimate of the amount of work compare with the work you think you actually did on the project?
I think I may have done a little bit more. I don't
Yeah.
think be vastly more. But just bear in mind, the 41 days, that's not concurrent. I might have done it
yeah,
a couple of days here and a couple of days there.
yeah. But it's in the right ballpark in terms of what
Yes.
actually happened.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
And we can see that your quote was originally £10,572.80, excluding VAT.
That's
You see
right.
that there.
Yeah.
Now, during the time you worked on the Grenfell project, were you also working on other projects?
Yes, yeah.
And in terms of your time on Grenfell, was it on an as and when required basis, or were you ever told that you were required to set aside a number of days per week?
We discussed programme, key dates in the programme, and I had to make sure that my other work didn't interfere with that,
Yeah.
which is quite common on virtually
Yeah.
all the jobs I do.
So you were aware of the general shape of the programme so that you could plan
Yes.
your work? Yeah. And turning to page 4, we look at that, and we blow that up. This is your quotation summary, and it's broken down, and then we've got this box on the right
Yeah.
with different little headings on the side.
Mm.
And we've got specifications. You've quoted in your breakdown for specifications. Do
Yeah.
you see that there? Does that mean that you thought it was part of your role, or you anticipated at this stage it was part of your role, to consider the materials that have been specified?
No, it was simply to put the details as specified on our drawing number 100.
But suppose the drawing from the architect didn't show a particular product specified.
Yeah.
Take the window infill panels, the white window infill
Yeah.
panels. Did you anticipate that it might be part of your job to select products and set out specifications for some of the external wall
I would
materials?
never have been expected to specify products, but in that particular instance, a product was suggested and it was discussed.
I see. And when you say it was suggested, you mean suggested by Harley?
Suggested by me to Harley,
Yeah.
to the team, yeah.
So is it your evidence that you didn't expect to be doing it, but actually in practice you did sometimes make suggestions about materials to be used in the external wall?
Yes, in a minimal way.
Then at page 6, we've got your standard terms and conditions. Under the heading, I want to look at the heading submissions, which is at the bottom of that page. Do you see that there? And
Yeah.
clause 4, Roman numeral 4, it says modifications, not redesign of architectural submission drawings expected up to revision B inclusive. Further requests for updates chargeable at standard bespoke design hourly rate. Can you help us as to what that meant? What does modification, not redesign of architectural submission drawings expected up to revision B?
It's quite common to issue your first drawing and receive some comments back from the architect. So then you would revise your drawing,
Yeah.
which would take the drawing up to revision A, not status A, but revision A. The architect may make further comments, which he shouldn't really do, but sometimes, historically, they do. They keep making comments upon drawings that they've already commented upon.
Yeah.
This is a clause to try and stop that, or else I could be revising drawings forever.
So you've said expected up to revision B. Does that mean you give them one chance to have another go, but after
That's
that,
right. Yeah.
you're not anticipating?
No, and really this is just to protect myself. Certainly in the case of Grenfell, no further costs were sent on to Harley for any of the drawings over revision B.
So just to be clear, this is modifications you're making in response to architects' comments.
That's correct.
Not modifications you're making to their designs.
No.
Okay. Now, you say, I don't think we need to pull this up, but in the final sentence of paragraph 14, that at that first meeting with Harley on the 12th of August 2014, you also discussed your attendance at a design team meeting on site at Grenfell the next day, yeah?
That's correct, yeah.
Would it be normal for you to attend design team meetings at site the day after an initial meeting on a new project?
Not often, but it's not unusual.
Did you get the impression at this stage there was time pressure to appoint a project designer on the job?
Well, there was certainly pressure to actually move the job along. Whether they were just being expedient, and I say they, I mean Harley, I don't know.
Right. Can we turn now to RYD 15549? So this is an email sent 3 days after that initial meeting you had from Daniel Anketell-Jones to Simon Lawrence Ryden. Were you told who the main Ryden contacts were on this job at the beginning?
Only at the DTM one.
At the design team meeting?
Yes.
Okay. And you're copied in, and Rob Maxwell of Harley's also copied in, and the subject is Grenfell Tower Design. And Daniel says, good afternoon, Simon. Following on from the meeting on Wednesday, I would just like to confirm that Kevin will be the main designer working on Grenfell Tower. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
And we are keen to get on with the design as quickly as possible. Therefore, we'll proceed with champagne cassettes, as discussed. We are going to focus on the details around the windows, which will allow us to finalise the extrusion design as quickly as possible. If you could send over the drawings submitted for planning, this would be a great help. We want to be sure all the right specs are on the drawings to start with and get as much signed off and agreed as we can. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, what did you understand him to mean when he refers to you there as the main designer?
I would be doing the actual drawing work.
He doesn't say Kevin Lamb will be the draftsman or Kevin Lamb will be the fabrication draftsman, does he? He says main designer.
That's right, main designer, but it is, he has addressed this as design manager, so one would assume.
One would assume what?
One would assume that he would be controlling the design.
And was that your understanding that Daniel Anketell-Jones as the design manager would be controlling the design?
Yes, if he wasn't doing it himself, he'd be passing it on within the company, yeah.
Yeah. And did that understanding remain your understanding throughout the project?
Until a later point when he stepped sideways
Yeah.
Then that passed over to a combination of Ben and Mark Stapley. But I think always Ray was in the picture.
And then we see in the fourth paragraph, there's reference there to we want to be sure all the right specs are on the drawings to start with. Can you just explain exactly what that meant? As far as you understood it.
Yeah, I think this is in relation to the actual champagne cassettes. I don't know, I'm making assumptions, I don't know.
Yeah, you don't know. Fine. Was it your understanding at this point that it was part of Harley's job to check the specification to date on the project and check that it was compliant with relevant requirements?
The NBS?
The MBS and the drawings that had been produced as part of the spec?
No, as I've said before, I don't believe so, no.
Now, at the time of the Grenfell project and after your appointment, did you understand that you had any duties under the CDM, the Construction Design and Management Regulations?
Not specific. Obviously, I should have a certain care that health and safety is considered.
Yeah.
But the lead designer should have the major concern with CDM.
Were you aware that as a designer, you owed duties to your client and duties when preparing or modifying a design under CDM?
No, I wasn't modifying designs.
So you don't think anything you were doing would fall within the definition of modifying a design?
No.
No. Did you ever do any design risk analysis or risk assessments for the project?
No.
On projects of this size and complexity, in your experience, would it be normal to have a matrix of responsibilities setting out which contractor or subcontractor was responsible for each element of the design?
I'd not come across that before, to be honest.
No. So that was not something you thought about on the Grenfell project?
No.
In respect of the design drawings that you produced, so you took the architect's drawings and you converted them into drawings that could then be used for fabrication.
That's right.
What quality control mechanisms did you understand Harley to have in place to check those drawings?
To check them for what?
Well, for example, for statutory compliance or compliance with the building regulations.
Well, I don't know what they had in place, but I wouldn't have expected them to be checking for compliance anyway.
Because why not?
But I think that was the architect's role. I mean, they would certainly have an overview if they felt there was a glaring non-compliance, but I don't think that was their ultimate role.
In terms of quality control more generally, leave aside compliance for the moment, were you aware that there was any quality control mechanisms in place in terms of your drawings?
All of my drawings were submitted to the team. I mean, to get the process correct, in the early stages, I used to attend the office maybe once a week, once a fortnight, spend a day in the office. Part of that day would be spent with Ray and or Dan and or Mark Stapley, and we would approach key design elements. And once we'd decided around the table what was required, I would go away, produce that, and for expedience, the drawings were often issued directly to Rydens, but they were always copied into Harley for a review. So they had an opportunity to review at the same time the architect was reviewing.
Now that's the early stages.
Yeah.
It sounds like you might have been drawing a distinction there then between what happened in the early stages and what happened later in later stages of the project.
Oh, it was, well, as you go on in a project, a lot of the drawing work is just dealing with architectural comments.
Yeah.
Concepts are generally dealt with in the early stages.
Does that mean as you went on in the design process that you didn't have the same opportunities to sit down with Ray and Dan or Mark?
Had the same opportunities, but we tended to, as time went on, it was only certain key items that provoked a round the table discussion.
Right. Now, I think you deal with this at paragraph 32 of your statement. If we go to that, it's on page 8 of your statement. So you're saying there, if we blow up 32, at the beginning of the project, I tended to go into Harley offices around once a week and attend meetings on site or in the office as and when was required. Towards the end of the project, I went in less frequently, subject to any issues arising. In the infancy of the design, I would meet with Ray Bailey and or Daniel Anketell-Jones and talk about the design and how to set things out. Ray Bailey would tend to provide conceptual input, for example, suggesting the extruded special profiles to make the installation easier. And Daniel Anketell-Jones would give more technical, structural and engineering input, such as the fixings and thermal values. You see that there?
Yes, agree with that.
And then you say, my usual practice following discussions at Harley was to send drawings to Ryden and Studio E and copy in someone from the internal Harley team. Both Ray Bailey and Daniel Anketell-Jones were more actively involved at the beginning of the design process, including for the first few revisions of each drawing. Later on, if there was a significant change or an issue came up, I would speak to Ray Bailey about this. In particular, I recall Daniel Anketell-Jones becoming less involved quite early on in the job as he was working on other Harley projects. Do you see that there?
Correct, yeah.
Now, if we just go back a page to look at the bottom of that page again, you say there that Ray Bailey would tend to provide conceptual input. Can you just help us? You've said, for example, suggesting the extruded special profiles to make the installation easier. Can you help us in more layman's terms as to what that might have meant?
Well, fortunately, he did a very good job on the flipboard when he was giving his evidence of the extruded angles. There's aluminium angles.
I see,
bolted
around the
to
windows.
top of the top and bottom of the window openings.
Yeah.
And although you could have something very simple, he took it to a further degree to make it a multi-purpose product.
Right.
So
Okay. And then you say Daniel Anketell-Jones would give more technical, structural and engineering input, such as the fixing and thermal values.
yeah.
Did you understand that Daniel's role there was limited to just structural matters?
I don't believe so, no.
If you'd had to describe what his role was in terms of inputting into the work that you were doing, how would you describe it?
Sorry, can you say that again?
How would you describe, I mean, you've said here, more technical, structural and engineering input, such as the fixing and thermal values. Are those the best examples you can give of how he was inputting into the design?
Yes, really, yeah.
Can you think of any other aspects that he inputted into?
Not off the top of my head, to be honest, no.
And what about fire performance? Did you understand that there was anybody within Harley who was helping with any fire aspects of the design?
I don't think there was specific requirements for fire protection other than meeting the requirements for providing cavity barriers.
So, just to be clear, is your understanding of the regulatory regime at the time that the only thing you needed to think about in terms of fire was cavity barriers?
Not the only thing, but the major thing, I think, yeah.
What else were you aware of that you ought to be thinking of in terms of fire performance and the facade?
Well, materials, obviously.
Yeah.
But none of that concerned me. It was all issued to me as a fait accompli. This is what we're doing.
And if you'd had a query about fire performance on the job, who would you have understood that you should talk to within Harley to help you with that?
I would approach the team at one of these round-the-table talks. If there was no one, if there wasn't a pool of people, I think I would have approached Ray.
So you say the team at one of these talks, that the team would be Ray Bailey and Dan Anketell-Jones, is that right?
It would depend. Sometimes it was Dan was there,
Yeah.
Sometimes Mark
Yeah.
Stapley was there.
Yeah.
Sometimes Ben was there.
Okay. So you would have seen Ben as part of that team, would you? That you could.
At a much later stage, yes.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, I think that might be. I'm part way through this topic, but I think that might be as good
Probably
a
a
moment.
good idea to stop at that point.
Yeah.
Yes. Right, thank you. Well, Mr. Lamb, it's time we all had a break for lunch, I think. So we're going to stop now. We'll resume at 2 o'clock, please.
Okay.
And I must ask you not to talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it while you're out of the room.
Understand that.
Thank you very much. Will you go with the usher then? She'll look after you.
Okay.
Right, 2 o'clock, please. Thank you.
Thanks.